This PowerPoint is going to discuss Philip II and the rise of Macedonia. This PowerPoint will take the place of the class we were going to have on the 25th of September. Now, there are three things that are going to be talked about on this PowerPoint: a brief biography of Philip II, Macedonian innovations in the Phalanx, and the Battle of Chaeronea, which is the defining moment for Macedonia's takeover of Greece. Philip II of Macedonia was born in 382 and he died in 336. He was king of Macedonia from 359 to 336. He is famous for being the father of Alexander the Great, but perhaps even more so, what he did is he took Macedonia from being a backwards northern Greek province, a province of Greeks, I should say, and turned it into one of the foremost military powers of the ancient world, and one that would have an undue influence on the politics and history of the Mediterranean for several centuries. Now, one of the really interesting things about Philip II is that he was a hostage in Thebes for 3 years, from 369 to 367. Hostage there not meaning a military hostage, but rather a hostage in the sense of an exchange of nobles between the two cities to ensure sort of fair play and cooperation between the two. Now, if you remember from the earlier PowerPoints and classes, that between the years 369 and 367, Epaminondas was in charge in Thebes, doing his innovations and tactics against Sparta, especially at the battles of Leuctra and Mantinea. So Philip II, who was there during these crucial years, may very well have been influenced by Epaminondas and his innovations in hoplite warfare. How do we know about Philip II? Well, we have some problems with the sources, mainly because the two major sources are the authors Polybius, who lived between about 180 and 120 BC, or 200 years after Philip, and Diodorus Siculus, who lived between about 60 and 30 BC, hundreds of years after Philip. So we have a problem with sources there. We don't have a whole lot of contemporaneous sources for Philip. We have a decent number of contemporaneous sources for Alexander, but not much for Philip. So whenever we discuss Philip and we study Philip, we have to be cognizant of the fact that many of the sources are from several centuries after. Now, how is Philip's army different from the earlier phalanx? Much as Epaminondas is famous for his innovations in tactics, Philip is famous in large part for his innovations in the phalanx. Not so much the tactics, but the actual makeup of a phalanx army. And one of the reasons that he was able to do this and create a phalanx that was much more successful than the Greek phalanx was that the Macedonians were known as a much more militaristic culture, more of a tribal culture than the sort of traditional Greek culture you saw in Athens or Sparta. The Macedonians were known for drinking, fighting, hunting, polygamy, all the sorts of things that the Greeks, in scare quotes, were not into. They were sort of hyper-masculine, or to use Dr. Moore's phrase, toxically masculine. And that differed from the sort of mainland Greeks that we've been studying. Many Greeks, in fact, considered them to be barbarians. Well, one of the things that Philip did was Philip created a professional army, both through conscription and voluntary enlistment. The generals, of course, would be drawn from the Macedonian upper classes, but the soldiers were actually a sort of professional army in the way that Sparta wasn't. Sparta, professional army, sure, but not because they were being paid and trained and sort of looked at the army as a career rather than as a social calling. The pay wasn't terrific, but what the army did was provided much of life's essentials, and the potential for booty during successful war was tremendous. Now, you could also have change for social advancement as well, and we see a number of generals under Philip and then Alexander who were sort of born in lower standing, who then used their military careers to become upper class. Now, another thing that Philip did was he instituted artillery and engineers as sort of separate classes. Under Philip, war becomes a science. Not only does he have engineers and artillerymen, but surveyors, botanists, agronomists, etc. He turns war into a science. And here's the major innovation, I think, is the use of cavalry. The Macedonians begin to use cavalry on a large scale. They had a long tradition of horsemanship and were excellent with cavalry. But what Philip and then later especially Alexander will do is make them a major fighting force. In particular, you have the companion cavalry, excuse me for advancing too quickly, what are called the companion cavalry, the elite soldiers of the Macedonian army, later to be commanded by Alexander as his personal troops. The companion cavalry used a sword and a spear, held overhand with the spear for downward thrusting. But they are sort of mounted hoplites, fighting with the sword and the spear as sort of traditional hoplites, but much faster and much more mobile and much more able to change a battle quickly. And Alexander will make the companions into a major fighting force, as you'll see in the next class. Now, another thing that Philip did is he made the phalanx 16 men deep, which is twice as deep as a traditional phalanx, which was 8 ranks deep. Each of his phalangites, which is what they called the professional soldiers in the Macedonian army, was equipped with what's called a sarissa, and you can see the word spelled there. A very long pike, approximately 18 feet long and weighing about 18 pounds. And it was made of a very dense, very thick type of dogwood known as cornel wood. They wore your standard helmets, so not much change there, and the lenothorax, and roughly a standard size hoplite shield. But the shield was held in place by a shoulder strap with a forearm grip, thus freeing both hands for the sarissa. One of the interesting parts of an 18-foot-long spear is that you have to hold it with 2 hands, thus negating any possibility of using a grip for your shield. Possibly a neck strap for the shield, which would also allow them to throw it over their shoulders on the march, which would make them much more mobile. And there's another word on the screen, hypaspists. While you have Philip creating this sort of new model army, you have what are called hypaspists. These are the heavy infantry, what we might think of as traditional hoplites, armed with the spears and the shields. But they become a separate class of soldier, not the entirety of the Macedonian army. Now, the Macedonian battle formation under Philip and Alexander, you can see, was very regimented, was very specialized. You can see in the center your phalanx with your heavy infantry. You see the elite heavy infantry, the hypaspists on the right, with the what are here called hetairoi, or companion cavalry. Those are the blue squares on the right, with peltas, the light infantry, on both sides holding down the wings, with light cavalry as skirmishers on the wings and in the front. Now, while the Macedonian army becomes much more specialized, you do have a problem with the Macedonian phalanx in that the sarissa makes the Macedonian army much more vulnerable to flanking. An 18-foot-long spear is much more difficult to turn with, and when you have 16 ranks instead of 8, it becomes that much harder. It's also vulnerable to close combat because of the sarissa, because of that 18-foot spear, the two-handed spear. In order to pull out your sword, you would have to drop your sarissa. The lack of a hand grip on the shield made the shield fairly difficult to use in close combat as well, because it was harder to control. And the depth of the phalanx meant a much shorter battle line, which left again it vulnerable to flanking. And really what you have, as you can see with this picture here, the purpose of the heavy infantry in the Macedonian phalanx was to anchor the center of the battle line and act as a tactical platform for the cavalry. Basically, you wanted to hold the center and allow the cavalry on each wing, especially with the companions on the right, to win the day. We will see this in practice with Alexander, especially at the battles of Issus and Granicus. Now you see here too an example of a gentleman, a Macedonian reenactor, holding a sarissa, and you can see just how long this thing is and how difficult it would have been to hold with one hand. Now, the very specialized army, you see, he actually breaks it down into fighting units. You might think of the modern distinction in armies with things like platoons, regiments, brigades, divisions. The smallest group or functional unit was what's called a decade. Believe it or not, it had 16 men, not 10. But the functional unit was what's called a syntagma, which was 256 men. And the syntagma, this smaller group, is really the functional unit. They worked as one. And what that means is you have, despite this large, massive army, you had functional units with separate commanders who could break off and do individual things. One Macedonian phalanx made up 16 syntagmata, and 16 syntagmata plus your auxiliaries per phalanx, which is about 4,000 people, including peltas, skirmishers, and cavalry. And one Macedonian army was broken down into 4 phalanxes, or about 32,000 men in the Macedonian army. This is a massive army. If you think back to the numbers at places like Leuctra or at Thermopylae or at Marathon, the Macedonians were able to put a massive army into the field, an absolutely massive professional army. A fast army too. As I mentioned, Philip creates a professional army. And one of the ways he manages to create an army that is so large but yet so mobile and powerful is by eliminating body men and women. So if you wanted to arm yourself for battle, you carried your own weapons and you armed yourself. He prohibited oxen from being used for pulling supplies instead of relying on horses, which are faster. And by forcing everyone to carry their own gear, and soldiers in Philip's army had to carry about 10 days of rations, about 30 pounds of rations, plus their own armor and their bedding, about 50 to 60 pounds there. So you have about 100 pounds of gear that you have to take with you on campaign as a Macedonian infantryman. That didn't mean they were slow. We have records of the Macedonian phalanx, marching 13 miles in one day, and individual cavalry units like the companions could in fact do about 40 miles in a day. This is unheard of with your traditional Macedonian phalanx. So these are the innovations that Philip makes in the Macedonian army. The next thing to do is, on the next video, is to see how these tactics will come into play at the Battle of Chaeronea.